You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. I can do those things because I'm not a hero. I'm whatever Gotham needs me to be.
They'll hunt you.
You'll hunt me. You'll condemn me. Set the dogs on me. Because that's what needs to happen. Because sometimes the truth isn't good enough. Sometimes people deserve more. Sometimes people deserve to have their faith rewarded.
The Spaniards, when Cortez conquered Mexico, they had a very hip attitude toward slavery, that they didn't buy slaves from Africa or anything. They would just enslave the native population. They even did that in Europe when they'd conquer a European country. And so when they conquered Mexico, there were over 30 million indigenous people living in Mexico, and a lot of them, they killed a lot of the Spaniards killed a lot of them inadvertently through the diseases, smallpox, measles, right, whatever. But they also in 1565, the Spaniards had a silver strike called El Rufo, and they discovered almost overnight that Mexico was one gigantic mountain of silver. And as soon as they discovered that, the days were numbered for the native population, and they just enslaved them. They had no rights. They just enslaved them promiscuously into the silver mines, the gold mines, and the different haciendas, and worked them to death in the fields. And within about less than 100 years from that moment, they had reduced the indigenous population from over 30 million down to less than 1 million, and they were in the process of going extinct. And the Catholic Church, which had been relatively cruel in their attitude toward colonization, they actually intervened. And they said, these people that, we may not think much of them, but they've got souls to be saved for Jesus. Therefore, there was no penalty for killing Indians. And they said, you're not allowed to kill Indians for no reason at all anymore. And you cannot work them to death in your fields and your mines.
Well, here's another one while I'm at it. This will add on to the discussion we've been having about the slave experience and capitalism that was derived from it. I'll go into more detail probably a little later because I have several pieces. I have several pieces that I've interspersed into it over the past couple years, but I think I might collect it together because it was a brother that was trying to talk about the indigenousness of Black people in the States, in the United States. And, the whole belief that the vast majority of Black people here were already here, which I don't even want to go into that because I'm sure they're going to pop up in my comment section when I put this up. But I want to continue the conversation since, you collect all this stuff. Like I said, 90% of the stuff I collect, I don't even put up. I don't even put in the video. Some of that is laziness, and some of it is just, I don't think it rises to the interest of actually putting it out in video form. But anyway, this is from a website, Indigenous something. You guys, Indigenous Mexico, I think it is. So you guys can check out the link and see what you think about it, but I'm going to read it and put my spin on it. The Africans of Mexico, from slavery to the 2015 Intercensal survey. Most people are not very aware of the presence of African slaves in colonial Mexico. In fact, some people believe that the influence of the African to Mexican culture is negligible at best. But the African laborer actually played an important and very indispensable role in the economic success of colonial Mexico. And in some parts of Mexico, the African made cultural contributions. It helps for us to remember that the Spaniards brought slaves to every corner of the American empire, and Mexico is no exception to this fact. One of the most detailed works about slavery in Mexico is the noted historian Colin A. Palmer's Slaves of the White God, Black Mexico, 1570 to 1650, which is quoted extensively in this article. The introduction of African slaves into Mexico, explains Dr. Palmer, was in part a response to the labor shortage stemming from the decline of the indigenous population during the 16th century. Spanish mistreatment of the Indians and a number of disastrous epidemics contributed to this demographic catastrophe. Several factors contribute to the dramatic decline of indigenous people of Mexico. Scholars Sherborne Cook and Woodrow Borah calculated that the population of central Mexico was 27,650,000 in 1519. This figure had fallen to 16,800,000 by 1532, almost half. There was an even more dramatic fall by 1,900,000 by 1580. By 1605, a mere 1,075,000 Indians survived. I played that piece maybe a year and a half ago, talking about Mexican slavery, and there was a researcher that actually said something about that. I think I will cut that out and actually splice that in front so you guys can actually listen to it. And there will be an addendum to this, to this piece, because he said it, and basically this is further evidence to support it. Because I was actually saying it to one of the brothers that called in when I was actually talking about this on one of my streams. Some historians have claimed that the indigenous population of Mexico in 1519 was as little as 10 million. There is, however, unanimous agreement that disease and overwork decimated a large portion of the indigenous population during the 16th century. Why was the decline of the indigenous population so dramatic? Historians believe that disease played the central role in the depopulation of Mexico's native population. Same thing in the United States. In fact, the United States actually learned from this decimation in Mexico, and that's how come they were passing out smallpox blankets to Native Americans in the United States. The physical isolation of the Indians in Americas is the primary reason for which disease caused such havoc with the native population. The physical isolation resulted in a biological isolation and a natural quarantine from the rest of the planet from a wide assortment of communicable diseases, which smallpox first ravaged New Mexico in 1520. No Indian had immunity to the disease. Same thing in the Native Americans. 19 major epidemics from 1520 to 1596. During the first century of the conquest, the Mexicans suffered through 19 major epidemics, the most serious of which occurred in 1520, 1548, 1576 to 1579, and 1595 to 1596. They were exposed to smallpox, chickenpox, diphtheria, influenza, scarlet fever, measles, typhoid, mumps, influenza, and coccolizity, can't even pronounce that, a hemorrhagic disease. Although this devastation made the conquest an easier task, it also caused a labor shortage that would lead to the introduction of African slaves. Another major factor in the decline of the indigenous people was the Spanish encomienda royal grant system, through which the encomienda, the crown or its delegate, granted to an individual worthy of reward the right to extract tribute and labor from a specified number of royal tributaries, in essence, Indians. In return, the grantee or encomendero undertook to care for the material and spiritual well-being of his charges. Unfortunately, this system was prone to corruption and frequently led to exploitation of the Indian charges. The decline heightened Indian suffering as the encomenderos competed for an increasingly scarce labor power. The whip, imprisonment, torture, rape, and killing played a role in the decline. Although the Indians were exempted from taxes and tithes, they were required to pay a yearly head tax. Both men and women were herded into mines and obrajeros, textile workshops, to labor for long hours. Sounds like slaves to me. The initiation of the African slave trade. Sickened by the plight of the Aboriginal population in West Indies, and I actually said this, Bishop Bartolome de las Casas, an apostle to the Indians in the Spanish New World, campaigned against the slavery of indigenous people. In 1570, de las Casas proposed to King Charles of Spain the slavery of the more durable Africans as a substitute. Charles agreed to this arrangement and granted the right to ship 4,000 Africans a year to Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. This arrangement marked the beginning of the Spanish participation in the slave trade of Africans. The first shipment of 4,000 slaves was sent to Hispaniola in 1517 and redistributed to Cuba and Puerto Rico. From this modest beginnings, millions of Africans will be brought in bondage to Spanish colonies, the Caribbean islands, and to North America. And for 4 centuries, the European slave trade fueled the Western economies and turned Africa into a continent of spent energies. It is believed that at least 100 small ethnic groups in Africa may have disappeared as a result of the slave trading. The need for an adequate and dependable labor force. As the indigenous population of Mexico declined, the colonial economy became more complex. The first silver mines were opened as early as 1534, and the cultivation of sugarcane started to take root in Mexico around the same time. Soon, textile workshops, cattle ranches, haciendas would be established. All of these enterprises, notes Dr. Palmer, required an adequate and dependable labor force for their sustenance. For the Spanish proprietors involved, an unpaid servile labor force was the most desirable. Faced with labor-intensive businesses and a demographic vacuum, the Spanish authorities convinced themselves that the importation of African slaves in large numbers was their only solution. In 1542, King Carlos V promulgated the new laws of the Indies, essentially abolishing Indian slavery in Mexico and the rest of the Americas. This event gave Spanish businessmen a stronger impetus to bring more Africans to the shores of North America. Dr. Palmer explains that as a group, African slaves performed the most strenuous tasks on the plantation. The belief that as workers, Africans were superior to Indians was shared by the Spaniards in New Spain and in other colonies. In the 16th century, many Spaniards held the popular belief that one black slave could equal the labor output of 4 Indians. We were the original machine, the original technology. In the period from 1521 to 1594, government estimates indicate that 36,500 slaves were brought to Mexican shores. Then from 1595 to 1622, 322 slaving ships delivered 50,525 slaves to Mexican ports. These slaves represented almost half of the total number of slaves brought to the Spanish West Indies. For the period 1622 to 1639, another 23,500 slaves were brought to Mexico, as tallied by Archivo General de Indias. With these figures in mind, one can say that an estimated 110,000 slaves were legally shipped to Mexico from 1521 to 1639. In the early decades of the slave trade, many of the slaves came from Guinea-Bissau and Senegambia, according to Dr. Palmer. Slaves from this area enjoyed a favorable reputation in the Indies for their alleged docility and trustworthiness. In the 17th century, the majority of the slaves brought to Mexican shores came principally from Angola and the Congo. The majority of slaves brought to these shores of Mexico were male. With the lack of female Africans, most of these men eventually chose Indian or mestizo women as spouses. The long-established Siete Paudisi laws of Spain granted slaves the right to select their spouses. Slave masters were thus forbidden from intervening in this decision. Professor Martha Menchaca, the author of Recovering History, the Reconstructing Race, the Indian, Black, and White Roots of Mexican Americans, observed that the legislation was of monumental importance because it became the gateway for the children of slaves to gain their freedom. Due to the lobbying efforts of the Catholic Church, the children of black male slaves and Indian women were declared free and given their right to live with their mother. With laws that granted freedom to the children of a slave who married into other racial classification, it was very obvious to see the motivation of this class to seek outside partners. The Spanish practice of classifying people by race was utilized in the Catholic Church records of colonial Mexico. While doing extensive genealogical research into colonial Mexican church records from 1600s to the 1700s, this author has spent a great deal of time exploring the marriages of slaves in various parts of Mexico. In areas such as San Luis Potosi, Zacatecas, I'm not even going to try to pronounce these names, I have frequently seen church records that documented the marriages of male slaves to mestizos, Indians, and mulattas. It is likely the offspring of these marriages would have been free individuals. It is a well-known fact that the marriages of slaves in the United States were hard to locate because, in most cases, they simply were not recorded by either church, plantation, or government bureaus. This is not the case in Mexico, where the countless marriages of slaves can be found in church records alongside the unions of Spanish, Mestizos, and Indian people. While exploring Mexican colonial census and church records, this researcher has been given a better understanding of the genetic and economic influence of the African in Mexico. In various cities throughout Mexico, epidemics would wipe out large numbers of Indians. At times like these, the percentage of black population would increase significantly because they weren't subject to the same diseases. A smaller pool of workers thus contained a greater number of Africans who moved in to fill labor vacancies created by the loss of Indians. As one example of a strong African presence, the city of Zacatecas in 1803 had the following population numbers: 11,000 Spaniards and Mestizos, 9,500 Indians, and 12,500 Negro and mulattoes. The figures such as these are a testament to the value of African providing essential services through labor to the Mexican colonial economy. While the Spanish and Europeans living in Mexico enjoyed the highest social prestige, were accorded the most extensive legal and economic privileges, those persons classified as Indians, Mestizos, and mulattoes brought up the other end of the social spectrum. The social classification Afro-Mestizos, persons of mixed Indian, African, and Caucasian bloods, was allocated the position in the lowest rungs of Mexican society because they were partially African descent, says Professor Machaca. They were stigmatized and considered socially inferior to Indians and Mestizos. They still are. Afro-Mestizos were subjected to racist laws designed to distinguish them from Mestizos and impose financial and social penalties upon them. Eventually, the wars of liberation during the first 3 decades of the 19th century brought an end to Spanish slavery of Africans in Mexico. Dr. Palmer has estimated the total number of African-born slaves brought to Mexico from the earliest years of the 16th century to the day that the institution was abolished in 1827 numbered 200,000. Although 200,000 individuals seems to be a large number in comparison to Mexico's overall population through the colonial period, it was quite small, and statistics indicate that the African and black population of Mexico never reached more than 2% of the total population at any given time. Since the 1820s, most of the African culture of colonial Mexico has been assimilated into the general population, but in some portions of eastern Mexico, it is evident that the African presence has left a cultural influence. Skipping down. According to the results of the 2015 Intercensal, there were 119,530,000 people living in Mexico. Of these, 1,381,000 were recognized as Afro-descendants and represented 1.2% of the total population of the country. The 7 states with the largest population of Afro-descendants are shown in the following table below. Of the almost 1.4 million Afro-descendants, the largest number, 304,274, resided in the state of Mexico. However, the southern states of Guerrero, Oaxaca, had the largest percentage of Afro-descendants, 6.5% and 4.9%, respectively. It's actually longer than that, but I'm going to stop there. When they argue that what the Aztecs or the indigenous population actually looked like, and they say they were black and they were indistinguishable from us, from African, from black people, it's not true. Okay, there was slaves on the boat. There were slaves on the boat with Cortez. I do believe brought 4,000 or 5,000 African slaves with him when they first came in 1519. They brought slaves with them. They know the difference between slaves and indigenous people. They knew the difference from the beginning. They brought them in because the native population was dying off of diseases and overwork. And saying that we are the same people as them is not true. It's not recorded. It's not historical. It's not genetic. It's not anything. There's no proof that black people, the Africans, were already here in great numbers. You know, they came before Columbus, said that there was a small group of Africans that may have landed on some shores, but they never integrated into the population. So when you see black people, you know, later on when they had photographs, like 300 years later, okay, you go from 1519 to 18 something, when they actually have photographs, you show a photograph of an indigenous person that looks like they're black, that doesn't mean anything because they're already mixed in. You have no clue of the genealogy of that particular person. Same thing here in the United States. By the time you see a photograph of any indigenous person that may look African, basically That's 200-300 years after the Africans have already landed. They're already here. They're already interspersed along the Spanish Empire and the French Empire. They all brought black slaves in. So the ridiculous notion that 90% of the people that were here, slaves that we descended from, were already here is bullshit, man. They recorded that. And they didn't. The reason that they had to replace them, if you ever see these people, they're small. They're indigenous people, for the most part, are very small. Okay? African people on the continent were some of the largest people on the planet, largest, most hardiest people on the planet, which is why they chose them in the first place. And the conquistadors and the Spanish and the Europeans knew that because they know what Africans look like. They know what they look like. They were constantly going down to, even before they traded for slaves, they were constantly trading down on the continent. The Moors brought indigenous Africans from sub-Saharan Africa up into Europe. They knew what they looked like. So this is just further evidence to actually bolster something I've already put up. If I can put it together, I actually find more pieces to this and actually put it up. I have to see how many. There's tons of pieces that go along with this. If you read Slavery's Capitalism, they've talked about Cortez and him wiping out the indigenous population for silver, which is a long discussion. And I probably will. If I do it, it's going to be on Patreon, man, because it's too long in detail. And I don't feel like doing it, for basically free on YouTube. It's too long, it's too detailed, and it's way too much work. Okay, so if I do that, it's going to be on Patreon because it requires way more work and way more assembling of the pieces. But that's all I got for this one. I don't know exactly when I'll put this one up. If I can edit it and get it in, it'll be on Tuesday. If not, it'll have to be on Wednesday. But with that, I'm going to jump off of this BGS out and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.